The war had turned the Pacific into a vast graveyard of steel and coral. From the skies over Saipan to the jungles of New Guinea, the Empire's sons had fought to the last cartridge and the last breath. But some, a rare few, had survived surrender. Captured not by shame, but by exhaustion, they were sent eastward across waters they had once sworn to die upon. Their journey would end in a land they had only imagined through propaganda leaflets, the United States of America. The transport ships moved slowly across the ocean, heavy with the cargo of defeated soldiers. On deck, under watchful eyes, the prisoners stared at the horizon that no longer belonged to them. The Pacific glimmered as if indifferent to all human passions. In their silence, there was no unity, only fragments of memory, burning ships, voices swallowed by waves, the flag torn from the mast. When they reached the port, a gray industrial coastline beneath an overcast sky, there were no cheers, no jeers, only the grinding of cranes and the echo of commands. American military police guided them down the gangplanks, their uniforms pressed, their boots spotless. The contrast between captor and captive was not lost on either side. For the Japanese, every step on foreign soil was an entry into a world beyond defeat, a kind of waking dream. The camp lay inland, far from the sea. It was a grid of barracks surrounded by wire and guarded towers. The winter air of the Midwest pressed coldly against their thin uniforms. Inside, bunks were neatly arranged, blankets folded with mechanical precision. Everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and wood. The prisoners were processed, numbered, and assigned tasks. Days passed in a rhythm of obedience, work, meals, silence, rest. To the Americans, they were disciplined and inscrutable. To each other, they were ghosts, carrying the invisible weight of dishonor. Letters from home rarely came, and when they did, they were censored, reduced to fragments of civility. Yet, amid the routine, life persisted. Small rituals formed, the careful folding of paper, the carving of tiny wooden figures, the silent observation of clouds through barbed wire. The guards watched them with a curiosity that was almost human. Many had fought in the Pacific, some had lost friends there. Yet in the camp, the enemy looked ordinary, thin, sunburned, polite. There were no samurai, no fanatics shouting banzai, only men. By spring, the camp began to change. The war's tide had turned irrevocably in favor of the Allies. News filtered in through newspapers read by guards and translated in whispers. Okinawa was falling. Tokyo was burning. The once mighty empire was dissolving in firestorms. The prisoners heard the distant thunder of history and understood what it meant. Then came a curious order from the American command. Morale programs were to be introduced in the camps. The goal was rehabilitation, humanization, and perhaps, quietly, re-education. Music was played through loudspeakers, swing, jazz, the pulse of a nation confident in victory. The Japanese listened without comprehension, but with fascination. These sounds had no equivalent in their world. And then, one afternoon in early summer, a new experiment began. It was a warm day, the light sharp and merciless. The guards rolled in barrels from a nearby town, metal containers that gleamed in the sun. The prisoners watched in confusion as tables were set up in the yard. Something unusual was happening. A rumor passed through the ranks. The Americans were distributing a drink. When the first cans were opened, a hiss rose into the air, that distinct exhalation of carbonation, unfamiliar and alien. The scent of malt and hops drifted across the camp, sharp and bitter-sweet. The Japanese stared at the golden liquid being poured into tin cups. To them, it was almost ceremonial. This was beer, American beer. The guards gestured for them to take it. Some hesitated, uncertain if it was a test, a trick, or an insult. Others, driven by curiosity, accepted. The liquid was cool, effervescent, utterly unlike the rice wines of home. Its bitterness shocked the tongue, its bubbles startled the throat, and yet, beneath that strange flavor, there was something disarming, a sense of normalcy, of leisure, of a world without war. They drank carefully, some in small sips, others with restrained gulps. The guards laughed softly, as though watching children encounter a new world. For a brief moment, the camp no longer felt like a prison, but a stage upon which history itself had paused. The sun hung low, the air hummed with cicadas, and in that fleeting moment, enemies shared the most ordinary of human experiences, the taste of beer. Later, in the barracks, the prisoners spoke quietly among themselves. The bitterness of the drink lingered on their tongues, like the memory of an unknown future. Some found it unpleasant, others strangely comforting. No one could quite explain why. Perhaps because it reminded them that they were still alive. The next morning, routine resumed. The same work, the same drills, the same wire under the same sky. Yet something imperceptible had shifted. The Americans had offered them a small piece of their world, and in accepting it, the prisoners had stepped, however briefly, outside the shadow of war. The chronicles of the camp would later record the event in a single line. On June 17th, a morale activity was conducted. Japanese prisoners were issued beer. No incidents. But beneath that sterile notation lay the quiet astonishment of men who, even in defeat, had not lost the capacity to be surprised. They couldn't believe it, not because of the beer itself, but because it had been offered without hatred. The days that followed were quieter than usual. The beer event had left a residue of wonder, a thin film of disbelief that seemed to coat every conversation and every gaze. The prisoners returned to their chores, mending fences, stacking firewood, clearing snow that lingered at the edges of spring. Yet the memory of that afternoon hovered like a fragrance that would not disperse. Some of the older men tried to erase it from their minds. They reminded themselves of duty, of the emperor, of the code that had defined their lives. But even they felt the crack in that armor. The beer, so mundane in the American world, had revealed something terrifying in its simplicity. That pleasure could exist without ceremony, that the enemy could smile without deception. For many, the first sip had been a revelation of texture and temperature. It had not tasted of surrender or humiliation, but of something indefinably human. The bitterness on the tongue, the slight dizziness afterward, the glint of sunlight caught in the rim of a tin cup, all of it had broken through the fog of ideology like a sudden shaft of light. In the weeks that followed, the Americans continued their morale experiments. They screened films, comedies with exaggerated gestures and laughter that echoed strangely through the mess hall. They distributed magazines filled with advertisements, shining cars, refrigerators, smiling families in bright kitchens. To the prisoners, these images were as surreal as any dream. A nation that could afford to smile this broadly, even in war, must have possessed a strength beyond comprehension. In the evenings, when the generators hummed and the guards' radios murmured in the distance, some prisoners tried to describe what the beer had reminded them of. One said it tasted like barley fields in Kyushu before the harvest. Another compared it to the wind over the sea near Yokosuka. A third said nothing, only stared at his hands as if the memory of that cold tin cup might explain the meaning of survival. The Americans did not fully understand the impact of their gesture. To them, it had been a small act of goodwill, a way to demonstrate civility. The war was nearing its conclusion. Victory seemed inevitable. To extend a drink to one's captives was not generosity, merely confidence. Yet, in the fragile space of that camp, it became a message more potent than any pamphlet or sermon. As summer advanced, the guards and prisoners began to recognize each other not as symbols, but as men shaped by opposing fates. The guards were young, farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Ohio, clerks from Kansas, who had seen the Pacific through binoculars or not at all. To them, Japan was an abstraction of fanaticism and rising suns, but in the camp, the enemy ate cornbread, repaired fences, and nodded politely. The distance between propaganda and presence grew smaller with each passing week. For the Japanese prisoners, adaptation became a kind of silent art. They learned fragments of English from signs and commands. They observed the routines of their captors, the way they smoked, the way they laughed openly, the way they filled silence with casual motion. What astonished them most was not American strength, but American ease, the absence of ritual, the effortless informality that allowed men to exist without pretense. The beer, in retrospect, seemed to embody that spirit. It was not revered, it was simply consumed. It required no toast, no invocation of ancestors, no elaborate etiquette. It was the liquid form of a culture unburdened by hierarchy. Among the prisoners, a few began to record their impressions in secret journals written on scraps of packaging paper. One described the experience as a window in the fence. Another wrote, "When I drank, I felt both shame and gratitude. The shame was for losing, the gratitude for being allowed to live." Outside the camp, the war was collapsing. The firebombing of Tokyo, the ruin of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the emperor's trembling voice over the radio. These were events transmitted through rumor and fragments of guarded conversation. The prisoners received the news not with shock, but with a kind of exhausted stillness. They had lived inside defeat long before it became official. When word of surrender finally reached the camp, there was no celebration. The Americans lowered their guard slightly, the Japanese lowered their heads. The war was over, but the meaning of peace was still undefined. The same wire fences remained, though their purpose had changed. In the weeks that followed the announcement, the Americans allowed more freedom of movement. The prisoners could walk the perimeter, tend small gardens, and even participate in supervised sports. And sometimes, on Sundays, the guards brought out the barrels again. Not as an event this time, but as routine. Another sign that the world was learning how to be normal again. Each distribution was met with the same quiet astonishment, though less fear and more acceptance. The bitterness of the beer no longer shocked. It had become familiar, even comforting. It filled the empty spaces where memory used to ache. The taste carried no politics now, only the faint sweetness of habit. Some prisoners began to talk of home, though home had become an uncertain word. Letters from Japan spoke of ashes, hunger, and rebuilding. The empire they had served was gone, but life, in its stubborn, indifferent way, continued. Perhaps, they thought, the taste of beer might survive as a reminder of what humanity could be when stripped of flags and commands. By early autumn, the camp's rhythm had softened into something almost pastoral. The sound of typewriters in the administration hut mixed with the rustle of leaves. The guards' laughter drifted across the compound. In the barracks, men carved small wooden mugs from scrap pine, polishing them until they gleamed. They lined them up on the shelves beside folded blankets, tokens of an impossible coexistence. The chronicle of those months was later reconstructed from diaries, military reports, and faded photographs. One image in particular became emblematic. A group of Japanese POWs seated at rough wooden tables, cups in hand, faces half lit by the sun. Their expressions were unreadable, neither joy nor sorrow, but something between the two. Behind them, an American guard leaned casually against a post, smiling without intent. The photo's caption, written decades later for a museum exhibit, read simply, "They couldn't believe it." In truth, belief was never the issue. It was recognition, the sudden awareness that humanity persisted even amid the machinery of war. The beer had been an instrument of that recognition, an ordinary thing elevated by extraordinary circumstances. The prisoners would later describe that first afternoon not as an act of kindness, but as an encounter with the unknown. And perhaps, they said, that was the real beginning of peace. Not the signatures on treaties, not the ceremonies aboard ships, but the moment when enemies could share the same taste and find it strange together. Autumn arrived like a slow forgiveness. The days shortened. The light grew softer, angled and golden. Leaves fell across the camp's gravel paths, caught briefly in the wind before settling into the mud. The guards no longer shouted as much, and the prisoners no longer kept their eyes fixed on the ground. The war, once an ever-present drumbeat, now existed as a rumor of the past. The world beyond the fences was beginning to reorder itself. Europe was already rebuilding, and in the Pacific, occupation forces were remaking Japan into something neither empire nor colony. The prisoners understood little of this transformation, but they sensed its gravity. They were part of something larger, the slow, uneven return of humanity to itself. Inside the camp, routines persisted. Roll calls, work details, maintenance. Yet a quiet gentleness had entered the structure of discipline. The Americans were no longer guardians of victory, but caretakers of the defeated. There was an awkward compassion in their gestures, a loaf of bread offered too casually, a cigarette shared without words, the unspoken recognition that war had been a kind of madness for everyone. On weekends, the morale programs continued. There were English lessons now and lectures about democracy. To the Japanese prisoners, these talks were strange sermons from another faith, built upon concepts that seemed both admirable and absurd. Freedom, they were told, was the highest good. To men who had lived within obedience, the idea was intoxicating and terrifying. One of the instructors, a soft-spoken sergeant from Minnesota, introduced them to American literature. He read passages from Walt Whitman and Mark Twain, words that hung in the air like foreign birds. The prisoners listened, not for meaning but for rhythm, that peculiar optimism that seemed to pulse through the English language itself. Later, one of them would write in his journal, "Their words are full of air and sunlight. We have only shadows and water." In the canteen where the guards kept their supplies, the barrels of beer became less a novelty and more a symbol of victory for some, of survival for others. Every few weeks, when the Americans brought out the drink, the atmosphere took on the stillness of a ritual, though none would have called it that. The Japanese lined up with quiet precision, receiving their rations with bowed heads. The guards, standing nearby, often raised their own cups in casual camaraderie. No toasts were exchanged, no speeches made. Yet in that silence there existed a communion more profound than any ceremony. For the first time since capture, laughter returned, hesitant, restrained, but genuine. The bitterness of beer and the faint dizziness of alcohol loosened the bindings of formality. A few guards and prisoners found themselves exchanging small tokens, a carved ornament, a pencil sketch, a pack of cigarettes. These objects, insignificant on their own, carried the weight of mutual recognition. Winter approached. The Midwest turned to iron and glass, hard frost on the fences, thin ice on the water tanks. The beer, when distributed, came chilled naturally by the weather. The prisoners drank slowly, cupping their hands around the tin cups for warmth. The liquid was the color of brass, glowing faintly under the dim light. Somewhere in the barracks, a prisoner began to hum a melody, not a military song, but an old folk tune about returning home. Others joined, their voices low and unsteady. The Americans listened from a distance. They could not understand the words, but they understood the longing. In December, the first orders for repatriation arrived. Japan, occupied but breathing again, was ready to receive its scattered sons. The process was slow, names checked, health examined, possessions inventoried. The prisoners cleaned their bunks and folded their blankets with reverence, as though performing a final act of service to the ghosts of their former selves. Before departure, the camp command organized one last gathering. It was neither formal nor festive, yet it carried the gravity of closure. The Americans provided a modest meal: bread, stew, fruit, and, at the center of every table, a few bottles of beer. The same golden liquid that had once shocked and comforted now stood as a quiet witness to the end of captivity. The prisoners drank without hesitation this time. They knew its taste well. Some closed their eyes as they swallowed, as though sealing a memory inside them. Others stared at the horizon beyond the fence, where the pale light of morning hinted at return. There were no speeches, but if words had been permitted, perhaps someone might have said that the war had stolen meaning from everything: food, honor, even the body itself, and that this small, unremarkable act of sharing a drink had given meaning back, drop by drop. When the ships came, the prisoners boarded in silence. The guards saluted them as they passed, not with ceremony, but with the easy respect reserved for equals. A few Americans slipped small gifts into the departing men's hands: photographs, ration chocolate, a bottle cap to remember the beer by. The voyage home was long and uncertain. The sea was calm, yet inside each man raged a storm of memory. They thought of home, of the faces that might no longer be there, of cities turned to cinders. But they also thought of the camp, of the strange peace that had existed inside the wire, the afternoons of laughter and the taste of that foreign bitterness that had become so familiar. When they arrived in Japan, the homeland felt like a shadow of itself. Cities were hollowed shells, temples reduced to stone, families scattered. The men who had once sworn never to surrender now walked among ruins as ghosts returned from another world. Society regarded them with suspicion, survivors of shame. In those early post-war years, they spoke little of the camps. Their stories did not fit the new national narrative of reconstruction or victimhood. And yet, in private moments, they remembered. They remembered the fields of the Midwest, the smell of pine in the barracks, the sound of American laughter. Most of all, they remembered that first can of beer opened under a cloudless sky. Years later, when Japan had remade itself into a modern nation, some of those men would gather again, aging veterans now, their hair thin and gray. They met in small restaurants or veterans' halls, speaking softly over plates of food. Sometimes they ordered beer, American if available. They would raise their glasses not in celebration, but in acknowledgement of survival, of shared humanity, of the strange, bitter sweetness of that moment in captivity when they realized the war was already over, even before anyone had said it aloud. One of them, in his memoir, wrote, "The beer was not freedom. It was forgiveness disguised as ordinary life." In museums and archives, the records of those camps remain, dry, factual, impersonal. Yet between the lines of "no incidents" and "morale activity completed," something human persists. The faint echo of laughter, the glint of sunlight on a tin cup, the astonishment of men who discovered that mercy could taste like bitterness and still be sweet. Time dissolved the sharp edges of history, but not its taste. Decades passed. The war receded into the sepia of textbooks, into ceremonies and documentaries, into the slow erosion of memory. Yet, for those few who had lived within the wire, the men who had once stood in line beneath an American sun, tin cups trembling in their hands, the memory of that moment refused to fade. In post-war Japan, remembrance took many forms. Some built shrines, others buried their uniforms, others still tried to forget entirely. But the former prisoners carried a private mythology, not of battles, not of defeat, but of an afternoon when enemies became human. The country around them transformed with astonishing speed. The ruins gave way to factories, the silence to neon. Trains rushed through rebuilt cities, and the hum of machinery replaced the drone of aircraft. The young knew little of surrender. They inherited peace as naturally as breathing. Yet beneath the surface of that prosperity flowed an undercurrent of questions. What had been lost? What had been learned? And what did it mean to begin again? For the old soldiers, memory came not as pride or regret, but as taste. They could not recall every face or every camp, but they could remember the beer, its bitterness precise, its chill exact. That sensory fragment became a kind of password among them, a way to acknowledge that they had once shared something inexplicable. Each year, on the anniversary of Japan's surrender, a small group would meet in a quiet tavern near Yokohama. They gathered without banners, without speeches. They sat at a long wooden table, their hands folded around glasses that reflected the amber light. The television in the corner played news of the world, conflicts in other lands, politicians speaking of peace with the same fervor others once spoke of war. The men watched without comment. Eventually, one of them would raise his glass. No words, no toast. Only the motion itself, slow, deliberate, almost reverent. The others followed, and for a few seconds the silence filled with everything that could not be spoken. They drank, and the bitterness spread across their tongues like the echo of history. To outsiders it was an ordinary scene, old men sharing beer. But within that gesture lived the memory of wire and watchtowers, of frost on tin roofs, of the strange generosity of captors who had offered a drink when hatred could have been enough. Some of them had tried to explain it to their children, but the story always sounded absurd. "You drank beer in captivity?" the younger generation would ask, bewildered, and the fathers would nod, smiling faintly. How could they explain that in the smallest, most mundane act lay the seed of everything they now valued, trust, tolerance, and the fragile idea that even in the ruins of ideology, humanity could still be rebuilt, one sip at a time? In the late 1960s, a historian from the United States traveled to Japan to interview surviving POWs. He expected bitterness, accusation, perhaps resentment. Instead, he found calm recollection and a peculiar warmth toward the American soldiers who had guarded them. One former prisoner, then in his 60s, told him, "They gave us water, food, and once beer. That was when I understood that we were no longer enemies. They had won, but they had not destroyed us." The historian recorded these words carefully, but in his published work they appeared only as a footnote. History, after all, rarely pauses for moments of quiet humanity. It moves in the language of battles and treaties, not in the shimmer of a cup of beer on a summer afternoon. Yet for the men who lived it, that was the moment that mattered most. Years turned into decades. One by one the veterans passed away. Their journals, when discovered, contained no great revelations, only brief notes about weather, food, and dreams. But scattered among them were references to the beer. Always that phrase, simple and unadorned, like a sacred code. One entry read, "Today it has been 30 years. I still remember the taste. It was cold. It was real." Another, "When they poured it, I thought of home. When I drank, I thought of nothing. That was peace." And another, perhaps the most poignant, "They could have hated us. Instead, they shared what was theirs. The bitterness was the same for both." By the 1980s, Japan and the United States had become allies, trading partners, cultural mirrors. The sons of former enemies now studied in each other's universities, married, built companies together. The idea that these two nations had once sought each other's annihilation seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet in that improbable friendship, the faint residue of that earlier encounter lingered, the understanding that peace was not born of treaties alone, but of recognition, the kind of recognition that can begin with something as trivial, as profoundly human, as sharing a drink. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a museum exhibition opened in Washington, D.C., titled "Beyond the Fence: The Lives of Japanese POWs in America." Among the photographs was one small, grainy print, a handful of Japanese prisoners seated at wooden tables, sunlight pouring over their shoulders, each holding a cup. Their faces were relaxed, unguarded. The caption read simply, "They couldn't believe." Visitors stopped before the image, puzzled. Some smiled, others moved on. Few lingered long enough to feel the quiet miracle contained in that moment, that the unimaginable distance between two nations at war had briefly closed, not through politics or surrender, but through the act of drinking together under the same sun. Historians debated the meaning of such gestures. Some dismissed them as trivialities of occupation, others saw them as early signs of reconciliation. But for those who had lived it, it was not a symbol to be analyzed. It was an experience, irreducible and permanent, a taste that defined an era's end. In Japan, as the last of the former POWs grew old, a few were invited to speak at schools. They stood before rows of students in neat uniforms, their voices trembling with age. When asked what they remembered most vividly about the war, their answers were not about battles or hunger or fear. One said, "The day I first saw snow in America." Another, "The music they played in the camp." And one, smiling faintly, said, "The beer." The students laughed softly, not mockingly, but with gentle surprise. They could not imagine war containing such an ordinary detail. And perhaps that was the point. The old man explained in slow, careful words that peace is not a grand event. It is something that must be practiced in small moments, in gestures that seem trivial but carry the weight of mercy. He told them that when the Americans gave the prisoners beer, it was not a gift of alcohol, but of dignity. It was proof that they were still men, not shadows of an enemy. The classroom fell silent. The teacher, moved beyond speech, bowed deeply. In the twilight of his life, that same man would sometimes sit by the window of his home overlooking the sea. On clear evenings, he would pour himself a glass of beer, always American, if he could find it, and drink slowly, the foam dissolving in the golden light. He would close his eyes and feel the distance collapse, between past and present, between defeat and survival, between enemy and friend. He would think of the guards' laughter, the hum of cicadas, the faint metallic scent of tin, the warmth of the sun on his face. And, for a moment, the barbed wire would vanish. The world would fall silent, and he would exist again in that fragile, impossible peace. When he died, his family found among his belongings a small wooden cup carved from pine and polished smooth. Inside, a note written in fading ink. June 1945, America. They couldn't believe, neither could I. The bitterness had faded from the beer long ago, but not from memory. It remained, not as pain, but as proof. Proof that even in the machinery of war, a single act of humanity can outlive the empires that tried to destroy it. Proof that the simplest gesture, the offering of a drink to the defeated, can echo through generations as a quiet testament to what men are capable of, not in victory, but in grace. And so the chronicle ends, not with an explosion, not with surrender, but with the sound of a cork, the hiss of carbonation, and the glint of sunlight in a cup, the small enduring miracle of belief restored.